All right, so here we are. We're starting with the book of Judges, and I want to first kind of just remind you, most of you were with us for the study of Joshua. No question, you need to see Judges as a continuation. It is meant to be a continuation from Joshua, and we can see that from the very first words of the book where it says, and it came to pass after the death of Joshua. All right, so it's a direct connection. It connects to Joshua. And so first of all, let's remember what we did in Joshua, some of the key things. Okay, so first of all, just to give the books in the Bible, I like to say the first books are, for the most part, stories, and they follow a chronological line, beginning of Genesis until the end of 2 Kings. Okay, then we have the major prophets, the minor prophets, and we have all kinds of other stuff. But, you know, these are primarily stories, which is the ones I love to teach because I love the stories. And, you know, so we have the 5 books of Moses. It ends, and of course, for most of the 5 books of Moses, Moses is the leader, the supreme leader. He is the ultimate prophet. He has the closest relationship to God that any human being could have. And when he dies, Joshua takes over, and that is the book of Joshua. After the book of Joshua, we have a period of chaos, and we can kind of see that in the name of the book, because it's called Judges. There is no one leader that, you know, it's named after. You know, we're going to have a similar thing with kings. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the word judges means, but it's kind of an amorphous name. What do you mean judges? Usually you think of judges, you think of the guy that's sitting in the courthouse. Okay, it doesn't sound like a leader. Well, are these people really leaders? What kind of leaders are they? But we already have a hint in the name itself, and also from the first verse in Judges. What does it say? After the death of Joshua, the children of Israel sought God and asked him, who will lead us, or who will go up first before us to fight with the Canaanites? So what we understand here from the very first verse is there is a leadership vacuum. After Joshua dies, there is no apparent heir, and the children of Israel themselves, understanding that there's business to take care of, are going to ask God and say, well, who's going to lead us? And God's answer is Judah will lead you. Now, Judah's not a guy. Judah's a tribe. Okay, so clearly we're looking at, there's already from that first 2 verses, we know we have a problem here. There's a leadership vacuum. Okay, of course that changes, and one of the things you can say about the book of Judges is that it is a transitional period, a very unsuccessful transitional period between Joshua and the book of Samuel. Once we get to the book of Samuel, we have very definitive leadership. We have Samuel himself, we have Saul, and we have David. Okay, so the book of Samuel is classic. Not that these guys were all perfect, but they were all very important and good leaders, you know, in one way or another. So here we have this Judges as this kind of transitional period, but also a completely different kind of book, dealing with between 2 books that show exemplary leadership, and the Judges is a mess. Okay, so that's first of all. Now we already have hints. Excuse me. We have hints already from the book of Joshua. Number one, that it is a very good time. All told, again, we studied the book. We know that not everything was perfect. There were problems. There were challenges. But for the most part, the period of time is seen as a very good time. But we also have hints of where the issues may develop. Okay, so let's first look at, I'm now in Joshua chapter 24, verse 31. This is the very, very end of the book of Joshua. And we have sort of a summary statement. Okay, Israel served the Lord during the lifetime of Joshua and the lifetime of the elders who lived on after Joshua, and who experienced all the deeds that the Lord had brought for Israel. So we kind of have this summary statement that says, as a whole, the nation of Israel was good and righteous and worshiping God throughout the time of Joshua. Now, where do we have hints that things are not going to be so good? If you remember, there were two speeches at the end of Joshua. And if we look at chapter 23, which is a speech definitely that took place, if you remember, chapter 24, we question whether that speech was actually at the end of his life, or maybe it was to a particular audience. But chapter 23 is clearly defined as it says in verse 1, Joshua was old, well advanced in years. We know it is a speech he gives towards the end of his life. And it's also a time when he calls all of Israel. So it's really, a time when he's addressing everybody. He's looking back at the period. And he says very clearly, let's just look at a couple of verses, chapter 23, verse 4 and 5. See, I have allotted to you by your tribes the territory of these nations that still remain, and that of all the nations that I have destroyed from the Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. The Lord your God himself will thrust them out on your account and drive them out to make way for you, and you shall possess their land as the Lord your God had promised you. We have here an indication, and we've seen this before, even prior in Joshua chapter 18, where they kind of finished the main wars, and Joshua says, what are you hanging around waiting for? Go out and take possession of the land. And when we talked about Joshua, we talked about the difference between defeating an enemy in war and actually settling the land and making it yours and getting rid of the nations that you need to get rid of and doing everything that the Bible expects them to do. So we already see in chapter 23 that there is a question mark here, because Joshua says to them, you see, okay, you've already been allotted all of this land where there's nations are. Okay, in other words, he's saying these nations that still remain, there are nations sitting in territory that have already been allotted to and captured by the nation of Israel. But he's saying to them, God will thrust them out on your account. But there's this, they have to do that, and you shall possess their land. In other words, it's not something that the nation of Israel can sit back. They have to go in and fight. And if they do fight and they do what needs to be done, God will help them. But it's part of it's kind of like said in a way of encouragement, but also here there's a hint of, well, this is something you really need to take care of. Now, we also can see in some of the wording that we have in Joshua, for example, if you look at Joshua 17, we're going to see a few different, and I'm just giving examples here, but there are more. Okay, Joshua 17, verse 12. The Manassites, the people of Manasseh, could not dispossess the inhabitants of these towns, and the Canaanites stubbornly remained in this region. Okay, that is a sentence. And then it says, when the Israelites became stronger, they imposed tribute on the Canaanites, but they did not dispossess them. That's in Joshua 17. Now take a look at Judges chapter 1, 27. And we're going to see a very, very similar statement with one small difference. Judges chapter 1, verse 27. Manasseh did not dispossess the inhabitants of Beth-Shan and its dependencies, or of Tanakh and its dependencies, or the inhabitants of Dor and its dependencies, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its dependencies, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its dependencies. The Canaanites persisted in dwelling in this region. This is almost the same thing, except in Judges it specifies certain areas, but we have the same idea. They didn't dispossess them, and the Canaanites persisted in dwelling. And then in verse 28, and when Israel gained the upper hand, they subjected the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not possess them. Actually, in Hebrew, the English is a little different. The Hebrew is exactly the same. Okay, in the Hebrew, in chapter 17, it says, where am I? Yeah, it's really exactly the same, but for some reason they translated a bit different. They imposed tribute on the Canaanites, but they did not dispossess them. It's the same thing. Okay, so we have a situation It's very, very similar, but there's one very subtle difference between the way this is described in Joshua and the way this is described in Judges. In Joshua, it says the Manassites could not dispossess them. In Judges, it says Manasseh did not dispossess them. So we get a sense here that there's a certain leeway in Joshua, okay? But at the point where Joshua dies, he's telling them, there's still stuff you haven't done, okay? He's giving them the chance. He's recognizing that, okay, he's already an old man. In his lifetime, they haven't finished. But if they continue doing what they were doing, they can finish it quickly. By the time we get to the book of Judges, even though it's right afterwards or shortly afterwards, okay, we already have a did not, meaning there's no more excuses. It's not they could not, they did not. There's this already implied criticism that they should have already moved on, but they didn't. They did not do what they were supposed to do. We have, now I will just remind us of what the original instruction is that God gave to the nation of Israel of what they're supposed to do, what I would call the ideal situation. So let's go first to Exodus 34. You know how it is with me. We jump all over the Bible. Exodus 34, verse 12. Beware of making a covenant with the inhabitants of the land against which you are advancing, lest they be a snare in your midst. You must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, and cut down their sacred posts. For you must not worship any other God, because the Lord whose name is impassioned is an impassioned God. You must not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for they will lust after their gods and sacrifice for their gods and invite you, and you will eat of their sacrifices. And when you take wives from among their daughters for your sons, their daughters will lust after your gods and will cause your sons to lust after their gods. Okay? And I really should have started with verse 11. Mark well, when I command you this day, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Okay, so basically, we have here the setup that God is saying, you do what you need to do. I will help you. I'll make sure these nations are driven out. But if you don't drive them out, and instead you make a covenant with them and you let them stay there, you're going to get in trouble. Okay, we have a very similar thing in the book of Numbers. Chapter 33. Chapter 33, verse 51. And here we have, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land. You shall destroy all their figured objects. You shall destroy all their molten images, and you shall demolish their cult places, and you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have assigned the land to you to possess. And then it goes on about dividing the land. And in verse 55, but if you do not dispossess the inhabitants of the land, with those whom you allow to remain shall be stings in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land in which you live, so that I will do to you what I plan to do to them. Okay, very clear injunctions here. Dispossess them, get rid of them, etc. Now, there is one other scripture that kind of modifies that a bit, and that's Deuteronomy 7. Deuteronomy 7, verse 22, we have as follows. The Lord your God will dislodge these people before you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them at once, else the wild beasts would multiply your hurt. Okay, so there are those people who see this as a contradiction. On the one hand, you're supposed to dispossess them right away. On the other hand, God says little by little. I don't think that's the case. I think basically God is saying all along, you have to remain intent on your objective. Yes, dispossess them. Don't let them get settled. Don't create treaties. But there's a recognition that this could take time for various reasons. One of the reasons given here in Deuteronomy is that if you suddenly make the land completely empty, you may have a problem with wild animals. But there is a recognition in Deuteronomy that this is something that can take time, but you have to remain intent on your objective. What happens when we get, and then we have, of course, Joshua at the end of his life, giving that warning that we saw in chapter 23, the importance of continuing the job, that God will stay with you and help you if you continue the job. What happens when we get to the book of Judges? We see that they stopped. It's not just that they're taking a long time, that they stopped, that they, and we, in these verses that I read to you about the Manasseh people, okay, that tribe. What do we say? Instead of driving them out, they imposed taxes upon them. Now, taxes is very often in the Bible is not necessarily money, but it's servitude. Okay, they have to give a certain time every month or every year that they're serving the governor or the king or whatever. Be that as it may, what they've done is they made an arrangement. They said, you can say yes, you're maybe subservient to us. You have to maybe pay more taxes or whatever it is. But meanwhile, they accepted their presence. And that already is going to become a problem that will influence the whole book of Judges. Okay? So that's part of what you see. And if you look at it in Judges chapter 2, verse 7, okay? Judges 2, verse 7. Okay, what do we have here? This is again a recap of Joshua, very similar to what we have in Joshua, but then it compares it to what's going on in Judges. The people served the Lord during the lifetime of Joshua and the lifetime of the older people who lived on after Joshua, and would witness all the marvelous deeds that the Lord had wrought for Israel. Almost exactly the same wording as we saw at the end of Joshua. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years and was buried on his own property at Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. And all that generation were likewise gathered to their fathers. Another generation arose after them, which had not experienced the deliverance of the Lord or the deeds that he had wrought for Israel. And the Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord. They worshipped the Baal and forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord. Okay? That then tells you in a nutshell the difference between the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. If at the end of Joshua we have hints of upcoming problems, but at the same time we have the hope that the nation of Israel will take heed, will obey Joshua's parting words, and will continue the process. Unfortunately, we get to the book of Judges, we see that is not what happened. They stopped. They created situations where the nations remain among them. They didn't continue settling all the land, and this just gets them into trouble. So that is really the background for the book of Judges. Now, one more thing that I want to deal with before we actually go into chapter 1 and start studying it is the word judges itself. What does it mean? Now, in the fact that I used the word judges kind of predetermined what you think the name is. The actual word in Hebrew is shoftim. Okay, now the word shoftim is usually translated as judges, but if we look carefully at the way it is used in different contexts in the Bible, we will see that it actually has two different meanings. So if you look at one possible understanding of the word shofet is that it is very similar. If we look at actually the root of shofet, it's shefet with like an F, S-H-E-F-E-T, okay? Very, very similar in sound and also in some places interchangeable with the word shevet, S-H-E-V-E-T. Okay, so it's the difference between shevet and shefet. Okay, two different roots. And the question is, what does this shefet mean? So there are instances where shevet, by the way, is the same word for tribe, but the word itself can also mean a judge. Okay, how do we see that? If you look at Genesis 49, this is the blessings that Jacob is giving to his sons before his death. And he says, with regard to the tribe of Judah, he says, now I'm going to I'm going to read this in English, but using the Hebrew word. The shevet shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Okay? In this case, the word is used as shevet, okay? But it actually is used to mean ruling. My definition in English says scepter. Scepter is actually very close in Hebrew to the word shevet. It's actually sharvit, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean scepter. It can just mean a sign of leadership, okay? That the sign of leadership will not depart from Judah. And we know that it has to do with ruler because of the next sentence where it says mechokek, the ruler's staff. Now, the truth of the matter is the word mechokek really refers to laws. I know I'm getting very complicated here because you don't know Hebrew, but basically the parallel here would lead us to believe that the word here for the ruling of Judah implies also some kind of judgment, because it's parallel to, again, the English doesn't show it to you, but it's parallel to the Hebrew word for the ruler's staff when it's really talking about the judges, the judgment, okay? So in this situation, this word can mean judgment, a judge, okay? On the other hand, there are other places where the same word shevet refers to leadership. Okay, enough. I got basically what we have here in Judges, though, and if you think about it in English as well, the word Judges, does it really apply to the context of the book of Judges? There's actually only one person in the book of Judges where it's very clear that what he, or that's actually a she, what she is doing is judging. Okay, so if you look at Judges chapter 4, when we start talking about Deborah, we say here, she used, this is chapter 4, verse 5, she used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites would come to her for judgment. And there's no question that Deborah, in this case, was a judge, the way we understand that word. Two people have an argument. They need someone to arbitrate between them. They went to Deborah, and she came to the decision. She was like a judge, okay? But everybody else in this book is not a judge in the legal sense. They're leaders, okay? It's very interesting, though, that there's no use of usually when the book itself doesn't talk about lead. In other words, the name of the book, Judges, it doesn't talk about leaders. Why doesn't the word, instead of being judges, why isn't it kings? Well, there's no queens, princes, governors, leaders, you don't know. I think, therefore, that part of the ambiguity of the use of the name of the use of the name judges or shoftim is to keep it ambiguous. These were not leaders. They didn't fit into the normal categories. They were kind of amorphous. And as we see, as we go through the book of Judges, none of them will be ruling over the entire nation of Israel. None of them have been elected or appointed to take care of all the issues of a particular time or for their entire life. Typically, they are there to solve a particular problem. There is an issue. God sends someone as a savior, as someone who can solve the problem, fight the given war, do whatever needs to be done. And of course, we have someone like Deborah, who also is a judge. So I think what we're doing is we're saying that these are people who are these kind of leaders, but if we talked about the beginning of the book as saying there's a vacuum of leadership, the very name of the book implies that. Because even when we see these various leaders, we don't really know what they are. Are they judges? Are they leaders? Are they governors? Are they temporary? Are they permanent? And like, it's a time that even when each leader comes in and takes its position, it's a sort of leader. okay, and not a clear leader. I see there was 2 questions. The last Torah portion, Achemot, that's what we read last week. After the death, same beginning as Judges. Yes, but it's not an unusual beginning after the death of. It is something that we will see at other times. Now, was Deborah from the tribe of Judah? Well, she was in the tribe of Ephraim. I believe she's from the tribe of Ephraim. She's sitting between Beit El and the mountain of Ephraim. So that's where she would be for. So she's certainly not living in the tribe of Judah. So no, I don't think she's from Judah. Okay. Anyway, now let's. We don't have very much time left, but I'd like to just do the first few verses of chapter 1. Okay. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, which of us shall be the first to go up against the Canaanites and attack them? The Lord replied, let the tribe of Judah go up. I now deliver the land into their hands. Judah then said to their brother tribe Simeon, come up with us to our allotted territory and let us attack the Canaanites, and then we will go with you to your allotted territory. So I just want to show you, where's my share screen? Why don't I have share screen? Oh, here it is. I found it. Okay. So do you see the screen?
Yes, we see the screen.
Okay, good. So if you could, and you see my mouse on the screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So if you'll see, this is the tribe of Judah, which is a very large territory. Simeon is in the middle of the tribe of Judah. Okay. So when, 1 second. Okay. So when Judah says to Simeon, join me, it's a very normal thing that he says this to Simeon because they live together. Okay. They're in the same thing, but it also says a very good thing about both of them that they take this initiative. Okay. When Judah advanced, the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands. They defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. Where is Bezek? Just to tell you, Bezek is between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, a little bit more to the east. So it's very close to Jerusalem. It's at the northeastern edge of the tribe of Judah. At Bezek, they encountered Adoni-Bezek, engaged him in battle, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and captured him, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has requited me. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. This is a very interesting story. It basically gives the story of one battle, a battle that is taking place after Joshua dies, and it is showing the continuation. In other words, Judah does pick up the gauntlet and continues to capture. There is no mention in Joshua, whereas we do know that there's a mention of Jerusalem in Joshua as one of the kings that was captured. Jerusalem is a bit of a complicated situation, which we'll see later on in this chapter, in the next verse, but there's no mention of Bezek. So basically Judah is saying, okay, I have my territory. I've conquered a lot of it, but there's still stuff that I haven't finished. And what he does is he goes and conquers Bezek. And it's kind of neat here because we see a humiliation of this Adoni-Bezek, but he had done the same to other kings. And if you're wondering why, they would have cut off his toes and his thumbs, clearly it was what was done in those days because Adoni-Bezek says, I did it for 70 kings. So he was doing this. So it was definitely a way of basically indicating that you have total control over this king. He has been completely defeated. And they brought him to Jerusalem and he died there. And then we have the next 2 verses. The people of Judah fought in Jerusalem, captured it. They, put it to sword and set the city on fire. After that, the people of Judah went down to attack the Canaanites who inhabit the hill country, the Negev, and the Shephelah, and the plain. Okay, so here we have a question. When did this event take place? Okay, now in the book of Joshua, we know, as I mentioned earlier, in the book of Joshua, Jerusalem is a city that is mentioned as a place that was conquered. In chapter 12, you may recall in the book of Joshua, there's a whole list of kings that are conquered, and the king of Jerusalem is one of them. So there was a war, and it was captured, okay? On the other hand, we learn later on, if you look at verse 19 in Judges, verse 19, it says, the Lord was with Judah, so they took possession of the hill country, but they were not able to dispossess the inhabitants of the plain, for they had iron chariots. Now keep going down. Verse 21, the Benjamites did not dispossess the Jebusite inhabitants of Jerusalem, so the Jebusites have dwelt with the Benjamites in Jerusalem to this day. So there's two problems here. Okay, on the one hand, we learn in verse 8 in this same chapter in Judges that he captured Jerusalem. Judah captured Jerusalem. We also know from Joshua that they captured Jerusalem. And yet we learn at the end of our chapter that they were not able to get rid of the Jebusites, and the Jebusites continued to stay in Jerusalem. And it was Benjamin that was the one that was living together with them. So is it Judah? Is it Benjamin? So first of all, Jerusalem is a city that straddles Benjamin and Judah, okay? And the actual border is the Temple Mount. North of the Temple Mount is Benjamin. South of the Temple Mount is Judah. So clearly, both tribes have an interest in conquering the city. Now, what we have in verse 8 is that they attacked and conquered the city and they burnt it. But what we learn afterwards is there were people still sitting there. Now, there are different interpretations. There's one interpretation that to me makes a lot of sense is in verse 8, when they're talking about, it says in Jerusalem. In the Hebrew, it says the Judites fought in Jerusalem and captured it, and they take that meaning in Jerusalem to refer not just to the city of Jerusalem, but the entire area of Jerusalem. And so what this interpretation would say is that Judah captured the whole area, burnt it, or a lot of it, okay? And then at some point, the Jebusites were able to come back and live in a portion of Jerusalem, that portion of Jerusalem which belonged to the Benjamites, and the Benjamites accepted them there. They did not succeed in driving them out. And we know that this city remains full of Jebusites until King David. So it's not just initially here we have a sense of, well, the Benjamites have the upper hand, but they let the Jebusites live with them, okay? By the time we get to King David's time, we see Jerusalem as a Jebusite city. There's nobody else there. It's a city that David has to capture again, as if it had never been captured before. So here, this is just one more example of things started out good, okay, but they end up problematic. One more thing that I just want to point out, I know I'm going a little over, but this will be very quickly. Verses 10 through 15 tells the story of the capture of Hebron, which we already read in the book of Joshua. It's the exact same story. It's Caleb. It is part of it that needs to be further conquered just outside of Hebron. It is Othniel who conquers it, and as a prize, he gets to marry Caleb's daughter Achsah. She then goes to Caleb and says, I need springs, and he gives her, in addition to the territory that Othniel had captured, he gives her these upper and lower springs. So we have that same story before. The main difference between the stories is that in the book of Joshua, before it gets to that exact story that's told here, we have in chapter 14, we have that whole story is in chapter 15, Joshua. But before that, in chapter 14, we have the whole story of Caleb going to Joshua and saying, I was at Hebron when I was one of the spies, and God, Moses promised me I would get Hebron. That whole connection with the spies is missing in the story of Judges. And in addition, Caleb is kind of mentioned on the side. The focus here is more Judah, where it says in verse 10, Judah went against the Canaanites who dwelt in Hebron. In Joshua, it is said as if Caleb is the one who does that. Of course, he has the people of Judah with him, but it's much more of a focus on Caleb. And I think that difference really, first of all, I believe that this story, both starting from verse 8 through verse 15, refers to events that happened during the time of Joshua. It's reminding us, now Judah, they're big warriors, they fight, they fought against Bezek, they won. Remember, Judah is the same people that conquered Jerusalem, and they conquered Hebron, okay? So it repeats that story, but whereas in the book of Judges, the point is to show Judah's role, leadership role, and how they succeeded in the past, and they at least start out doing the right thing. Here back in Joshua, the book of Joshua, the focus is much more on Caleb and to connect it to the story of the spies. They have different contexts and different messages, okay, in each story, but it's essentially the same story. So that is where we're going to end today. We will continue next week with verse 16 in chapter 1, and we will finish chapter 1. And we should be able to start chapter 2 as well. Okay, any questions? Any comments? Anything? Nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to see you all. Yes, sure.
I have a question.
Sure,
what period of time are we talking about BCE of the judges? What are the years for the judges?
Oh, I'm terrible at that. Oh, I have no idea. I mean, the truth of the matter is they're different. I mean, I could check it up, but there's differences of opinion, because if you ask most modern scholars, they will contradict what has been Jewish tradition. In other words, they will say that there was no exodus from Egypt, and the entry of the Jewish people into the land of Israel happened later. Okay, we say that the exodus from Egypt happened earlier, and that the entry into the land was 40 years after the exodus from Egypt. And the book of Judges, the book of Joshua spans about 20 years. Okay, and the book of Judges starts sometime after that. Okay, it's not right after his death, because we have a sense that it's after the entire generation. Remember, both in Joshua and in the book of Judges, we have this idea that Joshua's time was good, as well as the elders that remained living after Joshua. They were part of that same generation. So it's not right after Joshua's death, but it's some years, maybe a decade after Joshua's death, when that whole generation of elders has died out. That's when this book begins.
Thank you.
Sondra, one
Yes.
of my Bibles starts out Judges, dates it at 1425 BC, if that's of any help.
Judges 1425. Okay.
Yes, and that's, as you say, debatable.
Yeah. Okay. Who else? Diane, did you have a question? Oh, Liz, you had a question. Yes.
Can I ask you something about the book of Ruth?
Ruth. Okay.
Yeah. Is the Goel, kinsman redeemer, is that the same as the Levirate marriage?
Yes.
It is the same.
Yes. The book of Ruth, the Levirate marriage. I would like to point out one thing. In the Christian Bible, the book of Ruth comes right after Judges. In the Jewish Bible, it does not.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting situation, because the book of Ruth begins saying it's during the time of the Judges. Okay, so clearly, chronologically, it belongs here. And in fact, Jewish tradition says there is a judge mentioned in the book of Judges that we know nothing about. His just name is mentioned. His name is Iftzan. We know nothing about him other than that he was a judge. Jewish tradition said that Elimelech, who was Naomi's husband, was actually a judge, and he was Iftzan. You know, that's just a tradition, but that kind of would put it chronologically where it would end up. Yeah. And of course, we know that Ruth is the great grandmother, I believe, of David, something like that. Okay. The reason that Jewish tradition puts it at the end is because our books are divided not just chronologically, but in order of, shall we say, level of prophecy. Okay. And the book of Ruth is considered to be a lesser level of prophecy than the book of Judges. Take that as you will, but that's why it comes later.
Yeah.
Great story though.
It is. Yeah. Thank
Maybe
you.
we'll do that sometime.
Yes, please.
Okay, great. All right, so it was wonderful to see you all. Hope to see you again next week. We will send you a link to this so that, of course, for the people who were not able to join us live, but also if you want to hear it again, or if they're friends or people that you know that you think would enjoy this and would like to join us, then you can certainly send them the link, let them get a taste of it. And if they want to join us, that would be great. And we'd love to see them. Okay, bye-bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.